The Mafia boss noticed the maid hiding Bruises. "I'm just clumsy, sir. I bumped it on the cabinet." She forced a laugh, but the Mafia boss saw everything. He didn't see clumsiness. He saw finger-shaped bruises wrapped around her wrist, and he saw the fear that told him the truth. Someone who was supposed to protect her was hurting her. He decided right then and there. She was his now. No one touches his people. The first light of morning eased through heavy drapery and laid a pale stripe across the walnut of Dominic Valenti's desk. The mansion on Westlake Hill hung over Viridian like an accusation glass and stone, and the kind of wealth that taught people how to lower their voices. At 6:47, as he always did, Dominic set his pen down and lifted the small porcelain cup his housekeeper placed before him. Habit ritual, a tiny island of normalcy in a life built on careful calculations. Elena Ramos brought the coffee. She had been with the Valenti household 3 months, quiet, efficient, the sort of woman people labeled good and left at that. She moved with careful economy, shoulders rounded against attention hands, perpetually busy. Dominic watched the sleeve of her uniform slip as she set the cup on the blotter, and in that second, something smaller than a sound-registered skin, darker than it should be the distinct crescent of bruising carved by fingers. He did not lurch or shout. He asked almost gently, "Did you fall?" Elena's answer was small and mechanical. "I stumbled against a cupboard." Her hand flew to the wrist as if she could press the bruise back into invisibility. Her voice trembled. She spoke like someone used to swallowing explanations. Dominic's gaze didn't leave her face. He had made his fortune on noticing the infinitesimal and intake of breath, the way a lie sat wrong in the mouth. The bruise was not an accident. Finger marks recent and a little older, the layered language of repeated violence. He did not speak of accusations, only of rules. Under this roof, he said evenly, "No one harms the people who work for me. Not for any reason." Her composure shattered into a dozen tiny apologies. She pivoted toward the doorway, a sudden clumsy exit. Dominic did not call her back. Instead, he waited, letting that careful silence do the work of a loaded gun. When the door closed, the echo carried more than wood and hinges. It carried a promise. He summoned Patricia Koyama. She came without hesitation, a woman who had been the quiet backbone of the household for 30 years. Patricia moved like someone who had learned to understand what others would not say aloud. Dominic asked simple questions not because he wanted gossip, but because the shape of a life often lay in small, verified facts. Patricia spoke of a recent divorce, of nights coming home late, of eyes swollen from crying. She admitted she had noticed Elena flinch at the sound of a car, and that the girl kept her distance as if distance could be armor. Dominic's orders were concise. "Find out where she goes after work. No one follows her in uniform from this house. Cameras reviewed. Discreet." The implication was not subtle, he wanted to know, and he wanted it done without the girl knowing. Patricia nodded. She understood the difference between a boss who asked and a man who decided. Darius Cole arrived before noon with a manila folder and the quiet of a man who carried the nation of his employer's will in his shoulders. Pages slid across the desk, addresses, marriage certificates, a restraining order filed months ago and let to expire. The name printed in official fonts bore the casual evil of familiarity: Caleb Hayes, officer, Central Precinct, nephew of Deputy Chief Alistair Hayes. 2 domestic disturbance calls, no prosecutions. A judge's stamp that had closed without answering the girl's fear. Dominic's fingers hovered over the paper as if feeling the weight of fact through ink. A cop who terrorized a woman and wore the shield like a cloak against consequence. He had seen variations of that arrogance before. Dominic's life had taught him that those who believed themselves untouchable often had feet of clay. He did not say the words aloud. He catalogued them. He wanted the truth, assembled dates, times, patterns, so he could decide where to apply pressure. By evening, Felix, the young technician who kept the estate's dozens of eyes running, slid in a laptop and blocked the footage for Dominic and Darius. Grainy frames of blue sedan easing past the gate, the same car waiting when Elena left for the bus stop. A man got out, the posture of entitlement, hands moving with property. The camera's pixels flattened to reveal a face Dominic already knew the name of. Caleb Hayes, patrol uniform, sandy hair, that particular squint that never reached kindness. Dominic watched the video without a twitch. He turned the screen off and let the room darken around him. The city below moved in its ignorant patterns, morning into day, into the indifferent hum of commerce. In the hush, Dominic made a private resolution. There were rules in his world. You did not harm those under his roof. That was a line, not a sentiment. He would not approach this as a man acting on fury. He would approach it as a man who understood leverage networks and the slow work of unmaking a shield made of badge and family name. When he stood at the window and regarded the skyline, the first day's work had been done. He had seen. He had not promised vengeance. He had promised protection. The difference, he knew, was everything. The security room smelled of warmed electronics and stale coffee. Screens stacked like a vigil. Each one kept the city's small betrayals in silent judgment. Dominic lost the night to replaying the footage until the edges blurred the bus stop confrontation the way Caleb's fingers dug in. The rain-pressed evening when Elena slipped into a bus and left him pacing the curb. The most recent frame of his hand near her throat, a predator's whisper. He called Darius and Felix down and made the house that day a place of careful war planning. Felix compiled a timeline on the largest monitor frame stitched into a story. The incidents were not random. They formed a trajectory escalation, a predator testing boundaries and growing bolder. Darius, who had spent years cleaning up the messes men like Dominic created and then abandoned, did not need persuasion. This isn't simple stalking, he said. It's harassment with intent. He's breaking her day into pieces he can control. Dominic's instruction was methodical. Preserve everything. Create an undeniable chronology. Do not tip him off. No threats. No theatrics. If we fight his badge with brute force, we hand him excuses. We make it about the wrong thing. He drew the line between what felt like justice and what would invite disaster. They would not kill him. They would not plant evidence, and they would not involve threats that could unravel into open conflict. Instead, they would dismantle the structures that held him up, money associates, the network that made allegations evaporate. Elena came to his office that afternoon because he asked her to. She walked in like a woman who expected punishment and instead found a man who already knew. The confession came out in shuddering sentences, the marriage that ground into controlling behavior, the restraining order that lapsed the visits at odd hours, the nights when she did not sleep for fear of footsteps. She told him about the precinct, about men who stayed men because they were men in blue. Her words were small, a litany of helplessness. Dominic listened. He did not offer grand platitudes. He offered a phone number on a scrap of card, his private line. "Call me if he's close," he said. "Day or night." She clutched the card like a talisman. He told her to keep doing what she had always done. Be consistent. Be visible. In routine, act normal. Fear, he knew, was a weapon that could be broken by predictability when it was compensated by protection. He then summoned Silas Thorne, the consigliere, who kept legalities from tangling into their operations like barbed vines. Silas arrived without ceremony and took in the frames with a slow, almost grieving attention. "You want to go after a cop," he said. "That means dealing with an entire institution." He warned about heat investigations, political fallouts, men who could turn a hunt into a war. Dominic accepted the risk, but rejected blunt force. Silas proposed strategy, his voice precise, make the system do what it was supposed to do. Find the trail of money, the network of protection, the complaints buried in basements and inboxes. Bring those elements into the light, and let institutions choke on what they had earlier concealed. There were 3 phases to their plan. The first was evidence, documents, transactions, video, the pattern that no longer appeared coincidental. The second was exposure anonymously, feed the right outlets, and internal affairs, the facts they could not refuse. The third was pressure, public scrutiny that made excuses costly. It was not elegant, but it was surgical. Darius went to work finding the gaps between what a man's paycheck should pay for and how he actually lived. Felix began quietly indexing the bank deposits that matched amounts officers pocket when they trade favors for cash. A confidential informant at the precinct. Someone nobody noticed. Someone who saw everything from the janitor's closet, whispered hints that fit like puzzle pieces. Meetings with Mickey Bruno, a known runner for protection money. A partner with a gambling problem. cash deposits that did not equal salary. As the evidence stacked, Dominic felt a familiar satisfaction, not vengeance, but leverage. He told his team to be careful, no hacking that could be traced back, no burning of sources. The goal was legal exposure and the humiliation that came with it. Make his badge turn from armor into a shackle, he said. Silas approved the wording with an approving nod. Elena overheard some of the words, shocked, frightened by the machinery being turned on her behalf. She fled down the hallway in panic, only to be intercepted by Patricia, who folded her into a steady presence and guided her to Dominic. He met her fear with explanation rather than fury. He promised lawful methods, evidence submitted through channels that might finally be forced to act. The girl with bruises blinked through tears and for the first time in months believed the notion of someone shielding her without asking for a price. By late night, Felix messaged that he had enough to begin the chain reaction. Dominic sat alone for a moment, the city's lights stuttering below. He felt the old calculus of power settle into place, timing, precision, anonymity. He would not be an avenging angel. He would be an unseen hand that set the wheel of accountability turning. Caleb Hayes had thought himself a god beneath a shield. Dominic planned to make the institutions that shielded him accountable first, and in doing so to change the instinct of a frightened woman into the slow reclamation of her life. He turned the monitor off, but he did not turn his attention from the case. The next moves would be quiet and relentless, and for Elena's sake they would be inevitable. 2 mornings later, rain combed thin gray lines across Viridian's skyline. Dominic stepped into the security room while Felix scrubbed through fresh footage, blue light stroking the young tech's tired face. On the center monitor, a blue sedan idled at an intersection across from Sofia Ramos's building. Through streaking glass you could make out the driver, rigid hands at 10 and 2 eyes lifted to a lit second-floor window like a dog scenting blood. Dominic didn't speak. The small tendons at his wrist stood out where his hand rested on the console. He had learned a long time ago that anger could serve you if you taught it to heal. Darius came in with Silas minutes later, coat shoulders beaded with rain. Internal Affairs got the packet Felix reported. Acknowledged receipt. No other movement yet. They're vetting provenance, Silas said, and sniffing for the leak. They'll take their time. They don't have it, Dominic replied. But Caleb won't sit still while they look. He nodded to Darius. He's been bounced to a desk, Darius said. Colleagues keeping distance. He drinks late on the Riverview, usually flanked by 2 uniforms who like to hear themselves talk. He knows he's being watched. He just doesn't know by who. Keep the tail loose, Dominic said. I want him to feel the space around him thinning. Felix switched feeds. New footage, the harsh fluorescence of a grocery store. Caleb drifted in behind a small figure at the dairy case. Elena flinched when she sensed him. A hand brushed her shoulder, a half-smile that was all possession. She recoiled, nearly dropping a carton, then fled down an aisle, breath-breaking posture collapsing into flight. Felix froze the frame. Caleb's fingers on fabric. Elena's face white with the undiluted memory of pain. Dominic's voice scraped low. From this moment, he's a lawful target in every sense that matters. He left the room alone and stood before the mirror in his private bath. A cigar rested unlit between his fingers, a prop of old habits he rarely indulged. The glass returned a face the city called a businessman and whispered other names for. 2 ghosts looked back, the guardian who built walls around his house and the animal that had once clawed his way to safety. Don't fail her, he told the worse of the 2. Don't make her fear you the way she fears him. That night beneath the Viridian crest, Silas led him to a booth where Grace Nolan waited, a raincoat thrown over a sweater, a recorder in her palm that hummed with professional hunger. She'd spent years prying crooked nails out of official narratives. Silas slid her a curated copy of what they had already given: IA bank irregularities, timelines, faces of men at tables they shouldn't have shared. Names redacted where necessary, sources buried under layers of deniability. If this holds, Grace said, eyes flicking through pages, it's a bomb. Dominic didn't ask for gratitude. I don't want blood, he said. I want the truth to print. Then don't expect control after it does, she warned. Ink has a mind of its own. She tucked the packet away. I'll run what I can verify. Past midnight, the blue sedan returned to Sophia's block. From a dark balcony in a building opposite, Dominic watched Caleb stare up at the window where a light burned. The man's lips moved around a grievance only he believed. Dominic dialed the number they'd quietly scraped and kept from an old precinct roster. When Caleb answered, the voice in his ear was cool and unhurried. "Cold night to sit alone, Officer Hayes. Go home." Caleb spun in his seat, scanning shadows. The line clicked dead. Across the street, Dominic closed his phone and watched a long minute more. A warning without threat. A boundary drawn in invisible ink. At dawn, Elena found a petite bouquet on her matte white ranunculus and rosemary for remembrance, no signature. A card said only, "You're safe now." The words loosened something tight in her chest. She smiled, then flinched when a cruiser screamed past on the avenue. The coffee cup jumped from her hand and shattered against tile. Safety was a process, not an event. She swept the shards with shaking fingers, then forced herself to breathe until the quiver left. By noon, IA had formally opened an inquiry. Suspensions rippled outward. Someone in Bruno's circle gave a statement that included Caleb's name with an ease that smelled like desperation. Grace filed her first piece by evening, a concise needle threading financial misconduct and a history of domestic complaints that had evaporated in the precinct's heat. The headline was clinical. The subtext bled. Dominic read it on his phone, an impersonal smile barely touching his mouth. The campaign had moved from theory to momentum. The city began to murmur. The precinct's lobby filled with cameras. The mayor's press secretary practiced concern in the mirror. Inside, men who had laughed with Caleb last week now occupied other corners, phones, face-down eyes, calculating risk. In Sophia's kitchen, Elena watched two anchors discuss an unnamed ex-wife whose fear never made it into a report. She pressed her palms together and whispered nothing at all. Mrs. Koyama dried a mug and said what she believed. Justice gets there late, but it walks. Elena nodded once. I just want him to stop knocking on our door. Near midnight, Caleb shattered his bathroom mirror, knuckles blooming red, his own reflection breaking into a dozen ugly pieces. Who's setting me up? He shouted at the fragments. Far across town, Dominic stood at his office window, looking down at the black sheet of lake that returned no answers. You are, he said softly, to a city that never ran out of men like Hayes. 3 days after Grace's article detonated, the Viridian Police Department swayed on its foundations. Satellite trucks clogged the curb. Camera lenses peered over barricades. Officers slipped out side doors to avoid microphones. In a quiet conference room, a sergeant placed a badge and service weapon in a plastic tray, while Caleb stared at them like they might leap back into his hand by sheer force of will. Suspension paperwork slid across linoleum. Upstairs, a phone call cut the last threads of Grace. Keep your mouth shut, Deputy Chief Alistair Hayes said, voice so flat it hardly contained relation. This goes away if you stop feeding it. They're destroying me, Caleb snapped. Someone's pulling strings. Then don't hand them rope. The uncle answered and killed the call. In the parking lot, the dash unit in Caleb's sedan, not officially a fleet car contracted through a company with no obvious ties, recorded the entire exchange a legal capture because the vehicle wasn't his property, and company policy provided the consent. Darius sent the audio to a vault. Insurance, not ammunition. They were not after the uncle. They were after the man who liked putting his hands on women. At the mansion, Dominic sat at a round table while rain drew circles on the terrace stones. IA will test the origin of everything, Silas said, flipping a pad. We leave no fingerprints. Bruno went down yesterday, Darius added. If he talks, Hayes loses his fallback story. Felix ticked items off a digital list. We keep the papers 2 days ahead of the formal process. We tell the story before IA can water it down. Control the spine, Dominic said. Let them argue over muscle. Cracks split the precinct's fraternities. Greg Finch, Caleb's partner and co-beneficiary of traffic stop envelopes, sweated through an IA sit-down and then, faced with bank ledgers that matched his bad habits dollar for dollar, chose self-preservation. His statement slid to Grace via a route with 5 walls between source and story. Her second article landed with a harder thud, corroborated cash, a pattern of stops names hinted at in silhouette. Public patience snapped. The mayor demanded a full review. The union said little and looked around for a safer hill to die on. Elena watched the broadcast with tears she didn't know how to name. Relief had edges. It cut as it released. Sometimes justice limps, Mrs. Koyama told her, squeezing a shoulder. But it still arrives. Elena stared at the screen and said truth like a prayer. I just want him to stop coming here. That evening, Dominic met Grace in a high bar where conversations washed up against marble and drifted away. Who are you in this story? She asked, measuring him over the rim of her glass. Someone who hates men who hit women, he said, and left it at that. You're playing with fire, she said, not unkindly. Sometimes fire is what darkness understands. He made no ask beyond protection for the people who had trusted her. She promised the only thing reporters can, she would guard her sources like oxygen. The house gates rattled near midnight. Darius's hand went toward his jacket, but Dominic lifted 2 fingers. Let him. Caleb staggered inside the spill of security lights, sagging with liquor and fury. You think you're better than me, he slurred, shoving at nothing eyes snagging on Dominic like a hook. You think money makes you clean, you criminal piece of... The difference, Dominic said, voice so level it might have been a temperature, is that I don't beat women. Caleb lunged. Darius stepped once, caught an arm, and turned the man back toward the gate with professional indifference. The cameras recorded everything. The video hit the internet before the ice in Dominic's glass had melted. 1,000 comments poured gasoline. The department issued a midnight statement that used words like troubling and unacceptable. IA converted suspension to suspension without pay by breakfast. Watching the coverage, Dominic felt the small pull of a question he had been trained to ignore. He found Silas in the library later, where old law books still perfumed the shelves with dust and sanctimony. If I use fear to teach a lesson, Dominic said, what separates me from men like him? Silas didn't reach for philosophy. Motive, method, restraint, he answered. And the rule you set before you started. We don't touch him. We don't lie. We put truth where it can't be ignored. Justice is never clean. It still needs someone willing to hold it down while it thrashes. Darius pushed through the door at 11 with a text from their courthouse source. IA filed criminal referrals, he said. Corruption, extortion, harassment, assault. DA's office is moving. Dominic nodded once, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of a process finally grinding forward. Outside, Viridian glittered like a promise it rarely kept. On the other side of the city, in an apartment that looked like a crime scene without a body, Caleb paced among broken glass, yelling at a friend who wouldn't pick up, and a future that no longer returned his calls. The lights flickered. Somewhere, an elevator clanked and stopped between floors. The story had entered its last act, and the man who used to wear a badge could feel the building's bones creak under the weight of consequences he had never believed would find him. 3 days after the indictments, the Valenti estate felt unnaturally quiet, like a theater after the curtain drops, but before the crew begins to strike the set. Night rain had left the brick paths damp and dark. Lake air pressed through the cracked library window with the faint percussion of water against stone. Dominic sat beneath a brass lamp and reread the Hayes dossier, not because he needed reminding, but because fatigue made repetition a kind of discipline. The morning paper lay folded nearby, its headline, "A Deflection Officer Hayes Denies All Allegations." A soft knock. Elena stepped in, sweater damp at the shoulders, hair lifted at the ends by mist. She hovered until he motioned to the chair. "They're saying he might make bail," she said, voice small but steady. "If he walks out..." "You did the right thing by telling the truth," Dominic said. "Let the system finish what it started." She studied his face. "Have you ever lost someone the way I almost did?" To a man in a uniform who thought rules didn't apply to him, he let silence perform its function. When he answered, the words were without ornament. "Yes, and I learned fear wins when we give it our voice and then swallow it. You didn't." After she left, he stayed with the file but saw instead a different woman in a different year, a witness who'd signed an affidavit and then been found in a stairwell 2 nights later because a sergeant had warned the wrong cousin. He'd failed her because he'd misread the clock, assumed he had more time. The lamp threw a ring of tired light over the table. Somewhere far down the shore, a buoy bell tolled, as if agreeing with the memory. Silas came in with a face like weather. Alistair's pushing bond. If he gets the right judge at the right hour, Caleb could walk before IA completes discovery. Dominic closed the folder. We can't have him back on the sidewalk. If we lean too hard, IA starts sniffing for orchestration, Silas warned. We thread needles, we don't swing hammers. The call came at 10 that night. Elena's breath was paper-thin through the line. His car. On the street. Headlights aimed at our window. I'm sending Darius, Dominic said, already up, already moving. No contact, just eyes. He grabbed keys. Lock your door. Leave the lights off. Keep me on the phone. She complied, whispering between breaths. I can't tell if he's looking up here, but it feels like it. Her voice hitched. He cut across it gently. Listen to me. Inhale. Slow. He timed his words to his own breath so she could borrow its rhythm. No one is going to hurt you tonight. He said it twice for her, and for the first time in a long while also for himself. By the time he arrived, the sedan's taillights were a memory in rain on asphalt. Darius met him under the awning jacket beaded with water. He sat there 8 minutes, Darius said. Smoked, stared, drove off. Never left the car. The stairwell smelled of damp plaster. Elena stood in the hall, haloed by a weak bulb arms wrapped around herself, as if to shape the fear into something holdable. Dominic shrugged off his coat and set it over her shoulders. Next time he shows up, he said, quiet as a vow, he won't be a free man. Later in the soundproofed room behind his office, he and Silas poured 2 fingers of whiskey each and let the silence take its share. Dominic turned the glass so the fire in the grate winked back at him. Do you still believe in our version of justice, he asked without looking up. Justice is a tool, Silas said. It can be a scalpel or a shiv. The hand matters. I'll keep it sharp, Dominic said, and I won't cut the wrong throat. Morning carried new math. Felix came in, hair still wet from a rushed shower, eyes bright with the adrenaline of a clean pull. Latest statements. 50 grand in cash withdrawn in 2 days from a ladder of branches. He's building a runway. Give it to Nolan, Dominic said. It runs at dawn. What about IA? They can follow the stampede. Public pressure is the cattle prod they respect. Grace's story landed while the city's coffee was still too hot to drink. Bank trail suggests Officer Hayes prepared to flee Viridian. The photo editors chose a shot of him leaving a bar, eyes narrowed against flash jaw, clenched with the kind of entitlement that curdles fast in daylight. Comment sections became bonfires. A talk radio host demanded a no-bail hearing by noon. The precinct spokesman stumbled over the phrase, confidence in process. Dominic red-closed the browser and killed the screen's glow with a touch. The quiet part is over, he said to the empty room. We're in the noise now. Viridian woke inside a weather system of headlines. Screens in delis and lobbies scrolled the same crawl. Commuters compared updates between stops as if tracking a storm. At 10, the chief stepped behind a podium and tried to wrangle phrases like due process and integrity, while reporters lobbed questions whose angles were sharper than usual. IA served fresh notices within the hour. The FBI attached itself to the file with federal certainty. Silas watched the live feed and spoke like a man who had seen this choreography before. Once the feds are in, Alistair can't put his thumb on the scale without losing the hand. Good, Dominic said. Let them believe they're the authors. In Sophia's living room, Elena sat with a tea she couldn't taste while Mrs. Koyama held the curve of her knuckles. I don't want him in a cell because of me, Elena said, surprising herself with the truth. I just want quiet. Sometimes punishment is a sign on the road, the housekeeper said. It tells the next driver there's a cliff ahead. Downstairs in the mansion's security wing, Darius laid out confirmations like cards. Finch rolled, he said. Full detail. Dates, splits where the envelopes changed hands. Felix tapped a traffic cam clip, and the video puts Hayes in the pocket with Bruno. No need for us to touch a single bite. So he built his own gallows, Dominic said. All we did was point out the beam. IA's interview room smelled like industrial coffee and disinfectant. Caleb leaned forward, knuckles white on metal. Who set me up, he demanded. The investigator slid a still photograph across the table. Caleb's hand taking a folded stack outside a liquor store with a camera mounted just above the door. No commentary. Caleb's face twisted. She did this, he said, meaning Elena. Because men like him could only imagine women as cause or property. The mirror in the observation room returned the same old portrait of a predator stripped of camouflage and blaming the deer. Grace pushed the second phase of her series by mid-afternoon. The headline didn't spare the institution when the badge blinds how a department lost its sight. Editorial boards followed with calls for an external review. The name Alistair Hayes began to appear in chyrons not as a footnote, but as a subject. Politics is dominoes, Dominic said to no one in particular, eyes on the screen. Tip 1 watched the row shiver. He called Elena to his office at dusk. She arrived wearing the same gray sweater, now dry, but her posture held a new axis, something upright that hadn't been there before. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm afraid of what this costs you." He smiled a fractional smile. "I have lived in fear most of my life," he said. "I just taught it to be afraid of me back." Silas returned with a small alarm in his tone. "IA suspects an internal leak to the press. If they trace Nolan's pipeline, they'll pull at every thread. Some of those threads lead near us. Then we give them what they want to see," Dominic said. "A story that wrote itself. From this point forward, we stop moving pieces. We step back. Let gravity work." He ordered all tails pulled, all exterior surveillance reduced to what was already in place for the house. The machine he'd wound to life was instructed to idle. It went against his every reflex. It was necessary. 2 days later, a clerk wheeled a stack of paper into a courtroom and set it on the bench like a small tower. The district attorney read 6 charges each with the dry cadence of a nail hammered through wood: bribery, abuse of authority, terroristic threats, domestic assault, obstruction, money laundering. Reporters wrote the words down like minutes of a long overdue meeting. A caption writer somewhere typed "the Viridian case of the decade" and hit publish. Back at the mansion, Dominic watched the news roll without savor. Triumph didn't interest him. Outcomes did. He switched off the sound and let the images flicker through the glass of the balcony doors. Felix appeared in the doorway. "IA's hunting the source," he said. "Grace is disappearing for a while." "Good," Dominic said. "Phase 2 is complete. He's fallen, but the endgame's not written." He stepped outside. The lake held the city's lights as if they were coins on black felt. Wind slid across the water and up the hill, cool and clean. "Every piece that drops frees someone," he said under his breath. "When the board is clear, what's left to protect?" There was no answer, only the scuff of leaves and the steady tick of an unseen sprinkler cycling off. Somewhere across town, a woman he'd promised to protect was sleeping more than 1 hour at a time. Somewhere else, a man who had mistaken a badge for absolution was learning about locked doors. Dominic stood at the rail until the question grew comfortable in the dark, then went inside to the work that always waited. 2 weeks after the indictments, Viridian woke to sirens of a different kind. News alerts stacked one on top of another, a chorus announcing that internal affairs had widened its dragnet. The chief stood at a lectern flanked by flags and promised absolute transparency. Reporters called it Operation Clean Shield before the microphones cooled. Dominic watched the mute broadcast from his office sunrise sliding up the glass like a tide. His face held the stillness of a general after the cannons go quiet, measuring smoke for what it hides. The cascade arrived exactly as it should when pressure finally finds a seam. 11 officers suspended 4 resignations before lunch, IA subpoenas stenciled across calendars like warning tape. Grace Nolan's face flashed in a split screen as anchors credited her reporting for the Spark. On another channel, Deputy Chief Alistair Hayes sat beneath harsh lights in a hearing room and parsed verbs with the skill of a career survivor. Silas came in midstream coat, unbuttoned the air of a man carrying weight because someone had to. "FBI's officially in," he said. "No one can dam this river anymore." "Good." Dominic answered, not looking away from the glass. "When the water overruns, the mud shows itself." Across town in a small kitchen that smelled like toast, Elena watched the footage with Mrs. Koyama. The camera caught Caleb being moved between doors, cuffs at his back chin, stubborn and white. Tears broke over Elena's lashes. Not entirely fear, not entirely relief, the complicated weather of a storm finally rolling past the window. "I never thought he'd face anything real," she whispered. "Not every badge is justice," the housekeeper said softly. "And some people without badges carry it anyway." Back in the security wing, Felix threw a graph on the wall, a map of mentions boiling across the city. Justice. For Elena climbed multiplied became neighborhood chatter and office whispers. Dominic spared it a single glance. "Is she covered?" he asked. Darius shifted a finger on the tablet. 2 cars rotating on her block. Foot patrol from a friendly detail a street over. Nothing strange in the last 48 hours. "Keep it tight," Dominic said. An animal with its back to the corner remembers its teeth. Later, Silas found him staring at nothing. "You could rest," he offered. "For once, let the machine grind without your hand on it." "The battle's over." "It isn't," Dominic said. "You knock down one like Hayes and the vacancy fills if the foundation stays rotten. You can't save a city." "I don't intend to," Dominic replied. "I intend to make it afraid of the right things again." Felix slipped in with a new thread. "Rumor out of the jailhouse council's pushing Caleb toward a partial plea. He's blaming Nolan and an unknown source. IA is hunting that ghost." "That ghost is us," Dominic said. Silas's look was a small, precise warning. "If they catch a hem, they'll try to pull the whole coat." "We left a clean trail," Dominic said. "Even so, it's time to close the table." In the county lockup beneath fluorescent buzz, Caleb watched the same segments Elena had watched and tasted bile. His hand cramped around a dull pencil as he wrote to his lawyer, "If I drown, I'm taking everyone under with me." He pressed his fist into the cinder block until skin split. The camera in the corner recorded the eyes of a man who had mistaken power for permanence. That night, wind came hard off the lake. Dominic stood on the balcony with a cigar unlit between 2 fingers, listening to the city's metal and water talk to each other. "Tomorrow he'll do something stupid," he said to the dark, "and I'll be waiting." The alarm chimed at 5:57 a.m. Not the shriek of intrusion, but the clipped tone of a perimeter flag. Felix's script shoved the feed to every screen at once, a blue sedan easing along Elena's block, stopping without parking a body behind the wheel with familiar angles. Darius's voice was all muscle memory. "Hayes. He made bond." Dominic didn't waste a second on disbelief. "Spin up the team," he ordered. "Ping Detective Chun and Torres on the secure line. They have standing authority and an emergency protective order. We do this with law and camera by the book." Across a grid of pixels, the sedan idled in the pale wash of morning. The building's door was a rectangle of dim gold. Dominic leaned toward the glass as if proximity could alter the outcome. "This ends here," he said, voice flat as a seal. The clock over the console ticked to 600. Somewhere beyond the frame, a siren wound up like a throat clearing. Detective Sarah Chun and Detective Mike Torres were already on the corner when the sedan's engine sighed to quiet. They'd parked an unmarked car a half-block back and pretended to care about a cup of gas station coffee while their body cameras stared straight ahead. The text from Dominic had come in before dawn. "Stand by. Do not escalate. Long leash until he crosses the line." Inside the second-floor walk-up, Elena's phone buzzed with a message that arrived like a hand at the small of her back. "Stay calm. Stay inside. Doors locked." She parted the curtain a fraction. The blue car's door opened on a man who looked like the ruin of his younger self. Eyes ringed purple by sleeplessness, jaw sanded raw uniform, traded for a cheap jacket that didn't fit his swagger anymore. He didn't look up at her window. He went straight for the entrance and hammered the buzzer as if volume were a key. "Elena," he shouted, "open the door. We're going to talk." Inside, her fingers fumbled the phone. She didn't answer him. Her breath knew the old pattern and tried to return to it. She made it obey the new one Dominic had taught her. "Hold," Sarah murmured into her mic-weight set eyes, never leaving the door. Dominic's voice threaded into her ear through a secure channel steady as metronome. No contact until he breaches. Caleb pounded again, the heel of his hand redder each time. You did this to me, he yelled. I lost everything because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. His tone slopped from rage to pleading and back. The building swallowed and returned it thin. He reached into his pocket and produced an old key, the muscle memory of a man who believed access was a birthright. It rattled against the new lock like a bad idea meeting a better plan. The tumblers gave a reluctant half-click, years of use arguing with yesterday's upgrade. Now, Dominic said. The detectives broke their stillness at the same second. Sarah closed the distance cleanly, voice crisp and amplified by every training room she'd ever stood in. Caleb Hayes, she announced, badge, visible, camera blinking. Hands where I can see them. He spun, confused at the speed with which the world had arrived. This is entrapment, he spat. You're setting me up. The only trap here is the one you walked in carrying, Mike said, already moving to the control side, hand poised but not drawn. Caleb jerked, and that gave them everything they needed. Sarah pinned his wrist. Mike took the shoulder, and the cuffs were on with a hydraulic click that sounded louder than his curses. You are under arrest for violating an emergency protective order and attempted unlawful entry, Sarah recited every syllable for the record. You have the right to remain silent. He did not. She's lying. You don't know what she is. I am the you were Mike corrected, guiding him toward the unmarked sedan. Now you're a man who doesn't understand what no means. The building's hallway had filled with the small audience that always appears when a narrative reaches its climax, an old man in slippers, a woman in a robe, a teenager filming from the stairwell. Elena stayed behind her door and listened to the sound of handcuffs passing the threshold where monsters used to enter. When the latch settled again, she slid down the inside of the wood and cried into her hands. They were not the tears of a hunted thing. Mrs. Koyama, who had arrived early with fresh bread and a thermos of tea, knelt and pulled her close. Done, she whispered against Elena's hair. He can't touch you anymore. Body cam video hit the feeds before noon, clipped and subtitled proof that the arrest had been clean. Headlines did what they were built to do. Corrupt officer taken into custody at victim's door. Grace Nolan filed an update that read like a benediction more than a victory lap. Justice doesn't need a gun just to start. The city shared and argued and performed its bruised conscience in comments. At the precinct, a union rep canceled a press conference. At City Hall, a scheduler cleared a week. Dominic watched exactly once. Silas stood at his shoulder, searching his profile for celebration. Satisfied, he asked. Joy is for people who believe in prizes, Dominic said. I believe in completed tasks. Sometimes those are the same thing. Not in my line of work. By evening, the footage had taken its place among the city's new folklore. Elena opened the window and listened to traffic that didn't sound like surveillance. She placed the business card he'd given her into a small wooden box and set the box in a drawer that finally held something other than fear. I owe him everything, she said, not sure if she meant it for the room or for herself. And he never asked for a thing. That night on the mansion balcony, the lake stitched the city lights into a long shining seam. Silas leaned on the rail glass, catching moon. You did the right thing, he said. Do you still believe those words have meanings that don't rust? I don't believe in clean. Dominic said. I believe in balance. When darkness eats too much, someone has to light a torch. You always choose the threshold. From there, I can see both sides. The epilogue of the day wrote itself. Cameras watched Caleb duck into a courthouse door while reporters fed questions into the space he left behind. A job posting went live for a program assistant at the Viridian Music Center. Elena's application followed before midnight. Grace accepted a journalism award with a speech about ordinary courage and extraordinary persistence. Dominic did not appear in any of it. He never intended to. Close to midnight, Darius's message blinked onto Dominic's screen. FBI buttoned the case. No tracks back to us. Dominic nodded once to the room, to the city, to the version of himself that had almost reached for other methods and hadn't. He looked out over the water where the moon had drawn a pale road. Darkness doesn't disappear, he said under his breath. We just learn how to walk with it without letting it lead. The camera would have pulled back then if there had been one, leaving a man in a room where light and shadow divided the floor in equal parts, each kept honest by the other. 2 months after Caleb Hayes was led away in handcuffs, Viridian learned how to breathe around its bruise. Headlines shrank and moved to inside pages. Coffee cups clinked again. Patrol cars rolled a little slower past playgrounds. Dominic drove through downtown beneath banners no one had thought to remove, reading the municipal promises they once advertised in cheerier days. Internal reform approved. Clean Shield concludes. Trust damaged under repair. Early autumn gusted leaves along the boulevard and left him with the hollow aftertaste that follows victory when you've trained yourself not to celebrate. He met Grace Nolan in a small bar near the docks where the woods still held the smell of the river. She looked tired in the way only the truth can make you tired, but her eyes were bright. They touched glasses. "My final piece won't mention you," she said. "I know you don't want the credit." "Let me say thank you anyway." "Don't," Dominic replied. "Keep writing the things other people won't. That's thanks enough." Grace studied him over the rim of her drink. "Ever feel like you're playing God judges," he said. "I clean up after what people break." Across the city, Elena's life unfurled along a different axis. The Viridian Music Center smelled like lemon oil and sheet music, and children's laughter patched holes the past had left behind. She taught small hands to find middle C and lifted chins gently when shoulders tensed. On a Tuesday evening alone in the recital hall, she sat at the piano and let river flows in. You move through the empty space. Dominic stood in the back doorway with the quiet attention he gave to the rare things he refused to disturb. When she looked up, he was gone. A single white bloom waited on a chair in the third row. No card, no claim. Back at the mansion, Darius found him in the library flipping a page he wasn't reading. "Why her?" he asked. "Just justice." Dominic let the question stand a moment. "She reminds me of someone who once believed I could be better than the world I came from," he said finally. Darius nodded and didn't press. Silas arrived with a dusty bottle and a mood to match. "IA sent a thanks I'm not supposed to have," he said, lowering himself into a chair. "They're calling it a model operation with no fingerprints." "I know better." "I don't need gratitude," Dominic said. "I need fewer women afraid to go home." "You rescue everyone but yourself," Silas said, not unkindly. Dominic's smile was brief and thin. "Maybe I'm not allowed." The next morning, the city's paper carried a headline without exclamation or outrage: Former Officer Hayes sentenced to 18 years. No summation could encompass the months that led there, so the story didn't try. Dominic read to the end, set the page down, and said to the room, "Every sentence arrives late. What matters is that it arrives." In the surveillance bunker, Felix began the ritual of erasure. Drives spun. Redundant backups disappeared into digital weather. "We really wipe it all?" he asked. "There's no such thing as clean," Dominic said, watching the progress bars crawl, "only less dirty than the alternatives." That night, he drove the lake road without music. City lights stitched themselves across the water like an old scar shining when the temperature drops. He remembered the morning a sleeve slipped and a lie arrived already rehearsed. Rage had steadied his hands then. Now silence did. His phone vibrated. "I only wanted to say thank you," Elena said when he answered. "For all of it." "Thank you for staying," Dominic replied. She laughed softly. "You sound like I rescued you." "You don't know what you did," he said, and let the quiet hold the rest. He pulled over where the shoreline curved and the moon made a thin blade on the lake. Wind slid across the hood. Somewhere downtown, a late train mourned the day. Dominic watched the night and spoke to no one. Justice, he thought, doesn't live in the courthouse. It lives in the stubborn hearts that refuse to sit down. He didn't write it down. He didn't need to. Behind him, the city worked at forgetting and remembering in equal measure. The reforms moved through committee. New uniforms stood in line for photographs. Old ghosts found new corners to haunt. In a window, he could not see a woman practiced a sonata. In a cubicle under bad light, a reporter typed the last paragraph and deleted it twice before it felt true. In a security console, a row of green indicators burned steady. The storm had passed. The air still tasted of rain. When Dominic turned the key and eased back onto the road, the feeling that followed him was not triumph and not sorrow. It was the steadiness of someone who understood what his skill set was and what it would never be. He had put one man behind bars and kept one woman safe. For most lives, that would have to be enough. For his, it would have to be the starting point. 6 months remade the city in ways subtle and loud. Promotions pinned to crisp collars. A handful of retirements framed as legacy. Posters in precinct lobbies promising complaint hotlines that finally answered after dusk. Dominic stepped back from the edges he'd patrolled and let his days go quiet. The lake had a winter skin now. Rumors of the man in the house on the hill had thinned to the usual fiction. On a gray morning, a cream envelope appeared among the business correspondence he rarely opened himself. No return address, just a line across the front for the one who didn't give up. Inside a card in neat, careful handwriting, "Thank you for making me believe someone would stand on the right side." He read it twice and set it down the way a person places an heirloom aware of weight beyond its ounces. He let the house stay silent while his thoughts supplied the voiceover. People think justice is an ending, he told himself. It's the first step for those who were broken. Faces flickered in his mind's theater. Elena laughing without apology as a child missed a note and tried again. Silas lifting a glass in that resigned salute they both understood. Darius's nod, which meant he'd already taken care of it. When Silas arrived that afternoon, he carried a file thick enough to suggest trouble and thin enough to tempt hope. East Side, he said. Different names, familiar story. A girl being threatened. No help where she asked for it. Dominic weighed it in his hands without opening it. Viridian never runs out of shadow. What do you intend? What I always do, Dominic said. Turn on a light. Later he walked a block of hallway he hadn't needed to in months and stopped outside Elena's old apartment. The door's new paint hadn't covered the small ghost of the nameplate Ramos faint as a memory. He touched the wood with the back of his knuckles, an absurd private benediction, and left before the moment had time to ask for more. In the garage, Darius waited by the SUV. Do we start it up again? He asked. No, Dominic said. They start. We watch. Felix leaned in from behind a bank of monitors. And if the dark comes back, then we come back with it. Dominic answered, and none of them needed to say more. Across-town studio lights warmed the set where Grace Nolan interviewed Elena for a piece about survival that refused to call itself that. If you could speak to the person who helped you, Grace asked, what would you say? Elena looked past the lens into the only place such answers can be found and smiled as if addressing the air. Don't disappear, she said. Sometimes knowing someone is out there is enough to keep going. Evening gathered. The city stitched itself into a montage that would have embarrassed a lesser place, Dominic's car humming over the Viridian Bridge steel, glowing like a lit spine. Grace typing the final sentence, justice wears a human face flawed and unafraid. Elena standing before a semicircle of children guiding a wavering melody until it steadied and rose. Halfway across the bridge, Dominic braked and let the engine tick in the cold. The river below performed its old magic with the lights multiplying them into constellations no one had named. He spoke as if the water might keep the promise for him. Light doesn't beat darkness by force, he said. It stays. It waits. It refuses to leave. A gust slid through the cracked window and lifted the cream card from the passenger seat. It fluttered once, twice, then slipped out into the wind and sailed into the black surface below where the city's reflections took it in and made it part of their shifting alphabet. Far back, the camera that wasn't there would have pulled away. Viridian glittered and pretended not to be scarred. The lake told the truth and forgave it. Somewhere a phone began to ring for help, and someone answered. On the hill, a man closed his hand around a file, not to clutch it, but to carry it. He walked toward the door without hurry and without drama, the way you go to flip a switch in a dark room you know by heart. No credits rolled. The city wrote the next chapter the way cities do, messy, brave, afraid, stubborn. If anyone asked where the light came from, the answer would be the same it always had been, from hands that refused to let go. And if no one asked, the light would remain anyway, patient as dawn. Maybe the greatest truth is simple peace doesn't mean life is perfect, it means we've made peace with what we survived. If you felt something tonight, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from and what moment stayed with you? And if you want to hear more stories about finding light through the cracks, remember to subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for listening.